This is Transported from Rome to Austin, Texas, Part 5. Now, this is a slight change to the usual schedule because of the events of last night in Washington, D.C., where two young people were murdered in cold blood on the streets of America's capital. They were murdered because they had the temerity to attend a Jewish event at a Jewish museum, and they were presumed by the murderer, it seems, to be Jewish. It only turns out later that they worked for the Israeli embassy. There's no evidence that the shooter understood that. Sarah Milgram was a nice Jewish girl from Kansas City, Missouri, a peace activist, somebody who had years and years of involvement and experience with outreach to various Palestinian groups. It's not even clear that Yaron Lishinsky was Jewish. It seems that he may have come from an Israeli Christian family of some kind. None of those were credentials suitable to save them from execution on the streets of DC. For many online, they still don't think the motives of this murder were clear enough, despite him shouting "Free Palestine" afterwards. The same man, apparently, on handing himself over to the security at the event, demanded water and a safe space. It's like a microcosm of the whole conflict. Murder some Jews and then demand your rights. These events, unfortunately, may come as a shock, but not a surprise. I've been saying for a long time that this is where the stochastic anti-Semitism that we have been experiencing over decades, but that has increased in its fervor since October the 7th, where one uses the excuse of the war, and however you think it's being conducted, as an instrument with which to beat and apparently shoot Jews with, becomes something which is acceptable in public society because nobody's really prepared to do anything about it. Nobody wants to police the left or the right or the Islamists because they're scared to do so, or they agree with enough of the other parts of their cause that they'll turn a blind eye to this little peccadillo about the Jews and the one Jewish state. Already, you can see the mockery online underneath the various social media comments of people who are horrified. The ones justifying murder because they were Israelis or because they were Jews or because look what's happening in Palestine, or trying to draw a moral equivalence between this absolutely cold-blooded, premeditated, and unprovoked attack on two people thousands of miles from the conflict, and comparing that to the tragic but unfortunately inevitable collateral damage of civilian deaths in Gaza, today as it has been almost every day since October the 7th. My original plan had been to put out this episode and start to break the back of what we do to explain Israel's position in the world, exactly for the purpose of trying to avoid these kinds of incidents and especially their broader justification or tolerance by members of the general public. It's just another couple of Jews. It doesn't mean that we're all the Nazis now and that the Jews are all in danger. Or, well, they had it coming because they're the new Nazis, because they collectively haven't done enough to stop that evil, genocidal, ethnic cleansing monster of Israel. And these two even worked for the embassy. They totally had it coming. How do we prevent that? That was going to be what the next part was going to be about. The more time I spent thinking about it, the more I was realizing that it's going to have to be an entire sweep of episodes in several parts, as it is. And that actually, it's quite clear from looking at where my friends are today online, this is a seminal moment, even in 19 months of remarkable, in the most awful way, days that we have had. This is one of the worst. The US has always thought of itself as a safe haven for the Jews, and the American Jewish community has always assumed the same. It had always hoped, I think, that things like the Tree of Life incident were an aberration, just one right-wing nutjob. And indeed, unfortunately, the Jewish community has spent the last 20-odd years with its head in the sand over where the threat really will end up coming from, that it will come from Islamists and far leftists. Also, the right is a threat, of course. That's who carried out the shooting in Pittsburgh. But it is clear that the grand scale of where the problem now lies is more on the left. The whole point of this little sweep of parts of the Rome to Austin series has been to try and explain to you about Podcastistan and why it matters. Of course it matters because you have parties on the left and the right who are using their platform to vilify Jews, using Israel as the legitimized and clean tool to do so, because that's the new form of anti-Semitism, that shape-shifting virus that now gets to blame us as a state so that we can avoid looking too much like the parts of history where the left or the right, or indeed the Islamists, came after us for being Jews in other forms. That shining city on the hill, the New Jerusalem, that's literally what DC was supposed to be. And here we are, within spitting distance of the capital, and 2 of us are dead. One of the questions that I left open at the end of part 4 was to do with what it takes to get Trump to see us as an ally, as something useful to him. I don't think that political capital should be made of the deaths of these 2 young people. But that's not the same as using them as an example of where things have gone horribly wrong and calling for change in the most vociferous way. If there's one thing that Trump doesn't like, it's being made to look like a fool, especially on his home turf. He knows what it is to be shot at by his enemies. He understands that although we may not share all of our political opinions and values, we should have enough common humanity and decency to know that that is not the answer on the streets of the USA. I've argued before that, in my view, Jerusalem and Athens, and then London and Washington, D.C., were essentially the moral centres for the construction of the world as we now know it, that has been such a success. The defence of those values starts at the top. And of course, it cannot just be something that Trump does out of what I would hope would be the righteous indignation of America's president, seeing that 2 people who were effectively under his protection as diplomats in the capital city were murdered in cold blood in this way. It also is beholden on the Democratic Party to stop their internal and politicized bickering over the subject of Israel, and to speak loudly and with one clear moral voice. Obviously, these people were not fair game. That much just shouldn't even need to be said, but it has to be said, and at least it is being said, even by people like, I can't believe I'm saying this, but Linda Sarsour or AOC. But equally, and I'm not going to try and redeem Linda Sarsour, she's beyond the pale anyway, but people like AOC have got to start understanding that when they mouth off about things about which they really do not know enough, that they are a part of that stochastic problem that leads us to these 2 dead young people at this event last night. I really don't think that these people go into their mouthing off about Israel with any huge malice towards Israel or towards Jews. They're simply stuck in a moment of extreme upset because they've seen pictures of dead and mutilated babies and destroyed buildings for 18 months. And they see the Jewish community, a community that is supposed to have deep empathy, especially because of our own history of being abused and genocided and destroyed and ethnically cleansed, championing Israel nonetheless, appearing to excuse what they see as these excesses and these awful war crimes. And it doesn't matter how much we try to separate ourselves from any individual crappy action by somebody in the IDF or any general poor strategic choices by the Israeli government. We are all tarred with the same brush. If you support Israel in any way, you're simply beyond the pale at this point. Unlike what happens with Qatar, where people are just quite literally in their pockets and will say and do whatever is necessary to keep the dime or to stop the compromat coming out, the vast majority of people who speak out on behalf of Israel are doing so because they know the truth. They know what Israel is, they know what Israel does, and they certainly know what Israel is trying to be and trying to do, even when sometimes it gets it wrong. That's why people like John Fetterman came out of nowhere to defend Israel. It's why people like Richie Torres in New York does the same thing. Eric Adams. Nobody has to bribe or blackmail them to do that. And it doesn't mean that Richie Torres or Eric Adams or John Fetterman don't care about dead Palestinian children. Most Israelis care about dead Palestinian children. Yes, for obvious reasons, we don't see as many dead Palestinian children on Israeli TV as gets shoved down the throats of the West by the likes of the BBC or Al Jazeera or CNN, because they have an agenda to show that, and we have an agenda not to, because we are at war, and because it's understandable why that might not be so great for morale. But it doesn't mean that Israelis don't know, and of course they do see it, but they see it in a reasonable proportion to their own situation. What's happening in the West is that it is being seen in vast disproportion. Anyone would think, from the amount of time that is given, that Israel has massacred millions of people by now in the ruthless and cold blood of the Nazis. Anyone who scratches the surface understands that absolutely none of that is true. We're talking about some tens of thousands of people. There are so few examples of where things may have happened in cold blood that we can pretty much name them. Even though 200,000 odd reservists have cycled through Gaza, most of them have behaved impeccably under the circumstances. And of course, some of them have screwed things up or have been evil people who've done individually evil acts. There is just nothing to demonstrate that this is a systematic issue. And that is why what is being said against Israel in this way is just a giant canard. It is a blood libel, and it leads to blood on the streets, the blood of Jews. And that blood libel must be fought in every conceivable way. It has to be fought in the courts. It has to be fought in the court of public opinion. It has to be fought under the law. It also has to be fought kinetically. And I'm saying that because there are so few repercussions for some of these goons to come and scream and shout these banalities that they don't even understand what they're saying. But what that does is it presents a threat and an intimidation of the Jewish community that is simply unacceptable. And there must be ways for us to push back against that and make consequences for the people who show up to these rallies with such impunity. And if the police aren't prepared to act, there must be ways to do so. Now, I will be very specific. Within the bounds of the law, such as it is applied to the other side. If we're supposed to believe that in the UK, for example, there is no two-tier policing, then the kind of crap that they can get away with is surely good enough for us too. This isn't something where we are going to be able to hunker down and see it out. We're not in that kind of phase of conflict. The clock has gradually ticked in the last 19 months, from 1933 Germany to 1938 Germany. That's where we are now. We're seeing Jews in physical danger around the world. We're seeing those who've learned from history already packing their bags and thinking about how and when and where they might move if they need to. And we're seeing fewer places for them to run. Israel seems like pretty much the only option for most of us. I imagine within the US there will be certain states that are going to be better than others. I'm privileged to be sitting right now in Argentina, which at least under this government probably is the single safest place to be a Jew in the world right now, given the physical threats that Israelis are under every day, from terrorism that emerges from the West Bank, from the Houthis firing rockets, and who knows what other threats that are constantly being stifled by our various armed forces and intelligence agencies. By the time we managed to persuade the good Germans and the good Brits and the good Americans that something terrible was happening to the Jews of Europe, it was far, far too late. We have to learn two lessons from that. One is that we have to push a lot harder. We need our own friends to wake up to the reality of the situation we're in, that the Jews are still the Jews and that these other people are still the Nazis trying to kill us, trying to make us Untermenschen. And the second thing is that if those efforts fail, we must get out. We must get out of the UK, get out of France, get out of America, and go to places where we're actually welcome. And if that only place is Israel, then so be it. And if they try and get us all in one place and take us down there, then I suggest that they read a very good book that I remember being on my parents' bookshelf when I was a kid, called The Masada Plan. The rest of the world will come down with us. Mark my words. The Qataris have got nothing on what we can do if we want to make sure that everybody's feet are held to the flame. We know the pattern because every society that has pushed out its Jews has brought utter destruction upon itself. To return to the theme of part 4, Samson slew Philistines by the hundred for pleasure with the jaw of an ox. And then he set fire to their fields by tying the tails of 300 foxes together. And then, when finally he was entrapped by Delilah and his locks shorn and he was brought to their temple, he brought the temple down on them after they had put out his eyes, and he wiped them out. The Samson option, the Masada plan, call it what you will, but there will be consequences for messing with the Jews this time. As I've said before, we are not the canary in the coal mine as many people like to say, because the canary in the coal mine dies, and that's how the miners know that their time is nearly up and they have to get out. We will not be the canary in the coal mine for Western societies. We will have flown free as Western societies perish. It starts with us, but it never ends with us. And that is a message we have to ram home to our neighbours, to our political leaders around the world, to the ordinary person who doesn't want their country to disappear down a rabbit hole of the far left or the far right or Islamism or some weird unholy alliance of two of the three. Nor do they want to have a civil war between one or two or all three of those three. But that is where things are going. There's a very simple litmus test. If in the next week we don't see the entirety of Congress, from left to right, Republican to Democrat, and hundreds of thousands of ordinary Washingtonians on the street joining a march in solidarity against what happened last night, America is gone. And yes, you can have your recriminations that, well, if Trump had just got there a bit early, he might have saved us, or, well, it's because Trump was there that it was the problem. I decry that. I don't think that's what this is about at all. These are all symptoms of a much wider and deeper malaise. And if that's really what you think, then this is not the time to double down on the extremists of your own side, but to join hands with the moderates of the other side and do something about it. Reclaim your sovereignty. Reclaim it collectively, and reclaim your individual agency to do something about the problems in your society. If the murders were not in your name, then let the repercussions be in your name. So let us see and hear you, America and Washington. If you are no longer the land of the free and the home of the brave, then it is time that those free and brave citizens, such as there still are, should think about finding a new home. At least for the Jewish ones, Israel will welcome you with open arms. God bless America with the wisdom and bravery to do the right things. And I'm Israel Chai. Thank you for listening.